Hey, hello everyone. So today I'll be talking about the number of screens someone used back about, let's say, 40 years ago compared to the number of screens that we use today. So let's begin. So back in the 1980s to, I guess, the late 1970s to the 1990s, um, we had a television, CRT television. That's called a cathode ray tube television. It's a big, bulky television like this. We'll be talking about the 1980s first, in the late 1970s. You would typically have a CRT television in your home, and this would be the family television, something like this. And people did have televisions in their rooms as well. So typically, a lot of families just had one CRT television. And the television would be hooked up to a something like a cable box, like in the 1980s. This is the type of cable box that I had in the 1980s, and it would have a video game console like an Atari 2600 or a Nintendo Entertainment System like that. So a television would be hooked up to video game consoles or a cable television, and I think a cable television service costs about $20 back in 1983 or 84, something like that. And the fact you would also have a family computer, because computers were getting pretty affordable around the early 1980s with printed circuit boards and integrated circuits becoming being able to be mass produced in the late 1970s allowed micro computers to become mainstream. And the family would have a family computer, maybe an Apple IIc, an Apple IIe, a Commodore 64, something like that, or Atari 400, or IBM XT, or IBM AT compatible, or whatever. And laptops were not very common back in the 1980s. They were as common as cell phones were common back in the 1980s. So a lot of people didn't have laptops. Most people, not most people, you didn't have a lot of people with desktop computers either. So most people would have a television, a CRT television, with maybe a video game console. And if you didn't have cable television, you would just watch television with a antenna receiving analog signals. So in the 1980s, a typical person would just have maybe one or two screens. If they have a pocket calculator, that would be a third screen, I guess. So anywhere from 1 to 3 screens. And now let's get to the 1990s. Typical person would have a family television. They might have a television in their room. They probably would have a personal computer, cable television. Let's see how many screens that is. A television, computer, and a Game Boy. That was like a portable video game console that a lot of people had. I think it was released in 1989. I'm not really sure, but let me check. Game Boy release date. It was April 21st, 1989. That's when the first Game Boy was released. I had one also back in, I think, 1990 or late 1989. Actually wasn't mine, it was my sister's, so she let me borrow it sometimes. And We had graphing calculators in the 1990s. These became pretty popular. So we had access to probably 1, 2, 3, 4 screens, And let's compare that to today. How many screens? And when you get to the late 1990s and early 2000s, laptops became more popular. It became more mainstream as LCD monitors became less expensive and easier to produce. So around the early 2000s, laptops became mainstream. So we had a television, computer, laptop, that's 3. Really, these weren't really that common for a lot of people. People just used computers or video game consoles mostly. And graphing calculators. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. About 4 screens in the 2000s, I'd say. And now let's fast forward to 2022. And what kind of screens do we use today? We still use televisions. We have stuff called smart televisions. For me, I have a rear projection Sony Vega television. It's a 55-inch. That's what I use in the living room. People have television. Other people may have smart televisions. Nevertheless, it is a television. And have a personal computer, of course. And more than one, because computers are so cheap. And have a laptop, of course. Almost everyone has a laptop. Instead of having a graphing calculator. I don't know, maybe students still use graphing calculators, but this is not a screen that a lot of people would use. It would be something students would use, right? Instead of having that, we have something called smartphones, which we use for mobile computing. And we still do have video game consoles like PlayStation 4s and PlayStation 5s, Xboxes, and stuff like that. And let's see how many screens we use today. We use a smartphone, that's 1. We use computers, desktop computers. We use big screen televisions, that's 3. And some people have tablet computers, 4. I don't have a tablet computer. And did I mention laptop? So let me see. Laptop, desktop, smartphone, and television, tablet. For me, I do have a laptop, but I don't really use it that much. The only screens that I really use are, I don't use a tablet either. So the only screens I use are basically 3. And back in the 1980s, screens I used was desktop, television, and that was it. Late 2000s. I like break this down a little bit. 1990s, desktop, television. This is all I used back in the 1980s. I just had a television in my room for my video game console, or consoles. think I had two video game consoles. I had a Nintendo Entertainment System in the 1980s, and in the 1990s I had a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis as well. So two video game consoles. And later I got a PlayStation 1. I also got the Sega Saturn. I would always have two video game consoles, but they would be hooked up to one television. The early 2000s, still had a desktop, television, laptop. Let's not count the graphing calculators as a screen. That's just not a mainstream device that people use. Two of these, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, three of these, and late 2000s, desktop, smartphone, television, and you could put a laptop if you want. So the only new device that got added was a smartphone. I do use smartphones, so, and we didn't have smartphones in the early 2000s. It would be called a cell phone. I don't know if that counts as a screen. That probably doesn't. It was more like a telephone than a computer, like the smartphones that we have, which are ARM-based, which use ARM-based RISC processors. So pretty much, we do have more screens today. A lot of people are inundated with screens, but it really depends on the person too, because a lot of younger generation people, like the Millennials and the Gen Zers, I don't even think a lot of them have like large screen televisions. Most of the screens that they use is probably a smartphone or a laptop. So there's generational differences. Gen Z, Millennials, these are Millennials. Came before. They would probably use a lot more laptops, smartphones, tablets. I'd be in the Gen X category. People like me use more desktops, use smartphones. I don't know, maybe some Gen Xers use tablets as well, but I don't. And laptops are a necessity these days. I don't know, maybe the Gen Y and Gen Zs probably use the same. And pretty much. And we do use our televisions as well. Maybe Gen X uses more screens than Gen Y or Gen Z, maybe. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. We do have portable video game consoles as well. Nintendo Switch, stuff like that. I really wouldn't know if any Gen Xers are using portable video game consoles. I think we're too old for that. You know, we're in our mid. We would be in our mid not mid. Let me see. We'd be in our early 40s to 55 years old. So I don't think people like that would be using portable video game consoles or anything like that. Most of the computers screens that we use would be for work and communications or leisure, which is televisions. And I'm pretty sure these guys also use televisions. They probably use desktops too, I'm sure. They want to play the latest games, they would have to use desktops. So they use probably the most screens. And the later generations, earlier generations, the generations that came before them used less screens. So that's my take on it. So yes, overall we do have more screens compared to what we had back in the 1980s, which is quite limited to just desktop, computer, and I knew a lot of my friends that didn't have desktop computers either. Some of them didn't have it, but most of them had some kind of computer, whether that be an Atari 400 computer, a Commodore 64, Apple IIc or Apple IIe or something like that. They had some type of computer, and they all had televisions. They had a television in the living room for the family, which was a bigger television, and they had a smaller television in their rooms as well. So that was common. And, really, not much of a difference between here and here. 80s and 90s kind of like overlap. Early 2000s, we did have better technology, which enabled us to buy laptops at a much lower price. So it became more mainstream. So back in the 1980s and 1990s, a laptop was quite expensive. You could buy a laptop for maybe anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. It was a lot of money. And the reason for that was because LCD screens were very, very expensive. So as the engineers made the technology better, those screens became more available, and CRTs were eventually replaced with LCDs, and LCDs were replaced with LEDs, which we use today. So in summary, less screens due to the lack of technology back then, more screens now. But what I do is I use something called a KVM, which enables me to hook up multiple devices to one monitor, keyboard, and mouse. So I do have a lot more like devices today compared to what I had back in the 1980s or 90s. Today I have, in terms of devices, I have single board computers, video game consoles. I have desktop computers, plural. I got so many. I got a lot. I have a laptop. I got one laptop. Actually, two. I have an older laptop, the one that I showed earlier, and a newer one. The old one is not usable really, but I just keep it. Definitely have more devices, and people have multiple computers. I have, let's see, where I live, I have roughly see, maybe about 13 desktop computers all networked together. And I have quite a lot of monitors, but I use KVM, so I reduce the number of monitors that way. And I also use stuff like remote desktop access to access computers. So we have a lot of devices. The average person would have one desktop. So basically, we have more screens. So do I think this is a good thing or a bad thing? It's good and bad in a way. It's bad because we're so glued to our electronic devices these days. I think that's bad because when I was growing up in the late 1970s and 1980s, I would be doing a lot more outdoor activities, like going out, like biking with my friends, riding bicycles, riding skateboards, going to the park, swimming, going to my friend's house and swimming and stuff like that, just walking to the mall with my friends and stuff like that. But today, seems like everyone is just so glued to their screens. They don't even go shopping anymore. I mean, they don't even go to physical shops anymore. People basically they do everything online, right? They shop online. They don't have to go to the bank. They do banking online. Everything is just done on the internet, which is and the interface for that as a computer or some kind of computer. And the computer could be a smartphone. Computer could be a tablet computer. It could be a desktop computer. It could be a laptop or whatever. People are definitely more dependent on these electronic devices to get stuff done, from shopping to getting work done and everything else. So definitely we have more screens as a result of that, and that's my 2 cents. So anyways, if you have any questions, or if you want to leave your thoughts, you can leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching my Ace 1000 KS 1975.